It's terrible that after 50 years, it is behind closed doors.
It was terrible, but after 50 years of whispers behind closed doors, the room did not erupt when the ruling was read. Instead, it went completely colder. King Charles sat motionless as the words landed with brutal precision, each one cutting through years of palace understanding and private agreements. Camilla's authority over succession matters was not merely reduced, softened, or quietly reviewed. It was stripped away completely in a court decision that turned private royal influence into public humiliation. Charles did not reach for the glass beside him, nor did he ask for the words to be repeated. The High Constitutional Court, the final guardian of royal procedure, had issued a formal ruling declaring that Camilla held no authority, no advisory power, and no influence over succession. Succession meant the sacred order by which the crown passes from one royal figure to the next, and that made the ruling more than an embarrassment. It touched the very spine of the monarchy itself. It reached into heir recognition, guardianship preference, future accession protocols, and every paper trail shaping who would stand closest to the throne. Camilla watched the king's face before she watched anyone else, understanding his heavy silence before he could even give meaning. Charles set the file down with trembling fingertips, not because the language confused him, but because it was devastatingly clear. The court had not questioned his devotion. It had questioned the dangerous space his devotion had created. Camilla felt the wound in that difference. She was still the queen consort, still beside him, still publicly crowned, yet the ruling placed her firmly outside the one subject she could no longer approach. The silence sharpened when the private secretary turned to the sealed appendix, a confidential attachment added to a judgment when sensitive details cannot be spoken aloud in open session, carrying the phrase no one wanted to hear: unauthorized interference in succession adjacent counsel. Charles lifted his eyes slowly while Camilla went absolutely still. The words meant the court had gone far beyond ceremony. It had examined personal notes, annotations, and private briefings carrying her influence through doors where her name had never been written. Prince William received the news before the rest of the private household, and his reaction unsettled the aides around him. He did not smile, and he did not celebrate. The prince read the confirmation, placed one steady hand over the page, and breathed as though a danger he had tracked for months had finally stepped into the light. Charles looked humiliated, Camilla looked abandoned, and William looked ready. But before the palace could absorb the legal shock, the ruling began tearing through the people whose lives had been built around power, loyalty, and silence. This was never only about law. It was about a father, a son, a wife, and a future king standing on opposite sides of an invisible line. Charles saw the ruling as a deep wound to his marriage, while William saw it as vital protection for the crown. Camilla saw it as total rejection, and Catherine, watching quietly from the wings, understood that the family had reached a point where love could no longer hide power. Charles had spent years trying to make Camilla look accepted, settled, and secure, carrying her through ceremony, silence, criticism, and cold public judgment, believing time would soften everything. But this ruling did something time could not undo. It separated her personal place beside him from any claim of constitutional weight. That mattered because the monarchy survives on clear lines. A queen consort may stand beside the sovereign, but succession belongs strictly to the crown's legal order, not to private comfort, marriage, or emotional loyalty. William understood that line with painful clarity. The prince was not fighting Camilla as a woman. He was defending the future as a father. George, Charlotte, and Louis were not simply royal names on a chart. They were children whose lives would one day be shaped by every quiet decision made in rooms they were too young to enter. For him, succession could not be touched by preference, pressure, or palace rearrangement, because once confusion entered the system, it would grow. Charles found William outside the audience room, where the air still carried the heavy weight of the judgment. The king's voice was low, but the hurt inside it was unmistakable as he told his son the ruling made him look weak, exposed, and publicly diminished. William did not answer quickly. choosing every word like it might either heal the wound or deepen it, before saying that weakness would have been allowing confusion to continue. The sentence landed hard, forcing Charles to look away first. And in that brief silence, father and son both understood that love had become part of the problem. Camilla felt the shift without needing anyone to explain it. After the first briefing ended, she sat alone and slowly removed a ring from her hand, placing it on the side table as though one small object could absorb the force of what had happened. She was not crying, which made the moment worse, as her composure looked less like strength and more like someone trying not to disappear inside her own humiliation. Catherine saw what others tried to hide, noticing how several senior aides avoided looking directly at Camilla, a quiet avoidance that revealed more than any official statement, signaling that palace loyalty had already begun moving toward William's view of duty. Then, a private secretary informed Charles that all future succession documents would bypass Camilla's office entirely. The king heard the words and understood the grim meaning. A locked door had been built inside his own reign. The deeper the family searched for the beginning of the crisis, the clearer it became that one private moment had started the collapse. Every palace crisis has a moment everyone later pretends they did not recognize, and this one began on a rain-darkened evening inside Clarence House, when a private succession memorandum was carried into a room where it should never have been discussed. By morning, the paper was altered, the tone had changed, and William knew the boundary around his children's future had been crossed. Clarence House had hosted many difficult conversations before, but this dinner carried a different weight, meant to be discreet, controlled, and harmless on paper. Yet the document placed at the center of the evening was anything but harmless. It was a private succession memorandum, a written note used to guide sensitive future decisions about heirs, roles, and family responsibilities, concerning future heir protocol and youth guardianship language, meaning the careful wording around how young royals would be protected, prepared, and recognized if pressure ever reached the direct line. William had not approved Camilla's presence in that discussion, and that single fact became a spark. The original draft had described succession preparation as the responsibility of the sovereign, the direct heir, and designated constitutional officers, which was dry but safe language that kept the structure clean and the future protected. Then morning came, and the revised note carried one new phrase that changed everything: the Queen's advisory perspective. William read the line once, then again, and the silence around him tightened. Catherine stood beside him and took the paper carefully, as though touching it too quickly might make the danger spread, reading the altered wording twice before looking at him with controlled fear, knowing what he knew. This was not only a sentence. It was an opening that placed Camilla near a subject that should have remained beyond personal influence, and once that door existed even slightly, no one could promise it would stay small. Charles tried to calm the damage before it became a storm, insisting the phrase was harmless, a soft courtesy, nothing more than recognition of Camilla's place beside him. But William heard the hidden cost inside that explanation, thinking of George's future, Charlotte's position, and Louis's place within the family structure, as the prince was not willing to gamble with any of it. To Charles, the phrase protected dignity. To William, threatened clarity, and that difference turned father and son into opposing forces. The evidence later made denial impossible, as the revised memorandum was matched against handwritten dinner notes, proving the controversial wording entered the record after that private discussion, not through the proper constitutional channel. A court clerk's chronology then placed the Clarence House succession memorandum dinner as the first formal evidence reviewed during the challenge. What began as a family disagreement had become a constitutional crisis, and when William finally confronted Charles about that night, the argument did not stay legal. It became personal, raw, and impossible to contain. The ruling may have been delivered in court, but the real explosion came when father and son faced each other with no papers left to hide behind. The heavy wooden door closed softly, but everyone waiting in the outer corridor heard the sharp scraping of the chair inside, signaling that the boundary between private family grief and royal finality had been crossed forever. Inside the room, Charles and William stood across from each other, not as a reigning monarch and his chosen heir, but as two deeply wounded men carrying entirely different versions of what duty meant to the survival of the crown. Charles wanted the lifetime of loyalty to his wife recognized and protected, while William demanded that the succession remain untainted by personal affection or informal palace influence. Camilla waited in the cold gallery just beyond the room, and for the first time in her decades near the center of power, even she realized she could not enter this conversation. Charles carried the raw humiliation into that private Buckingham Palace sitting room like an open wound that no one else could see fully, yet everyone could feel. The court's ruling had already been circulated to senior household officials, and that mattered immensely because once a judgment reaches the working heart of the palace administration, it ceases to be a private family pain and becomes hard operating law. Buckingham Palace, the central administrative home of the monarchy, was no longer just holding a difficult family disagreement. It was holding a historic constitutional break. William knew it, Charles knew it, and the suffocating silence between them made both men sound louder even before either of them spoke a single word. William stood remarkably firm because there was no aide standing beside him, no courtier waiting to soften the meaning of his presence, and no private secretary ready to turn raw anger into polished, diplomatic language. The small sitting room had become the one place in the entire kingdom where the truth could not be edited, managed, or rewritten to protect royal feelings. Charles sharply accused his son of allowing the High Court to publicly humiliate Camilla in front of the very institution she had spent years trying to survive and appease. He spoke with the intense pain of a protective husband, completely forgetting the caution expected of a reigning monarch. William lowered his voice significantly, and that cold restraint made his answer cut much sharper through the air. He told the king that the humiliation had not actually begun in the courtroom. It had begun the exact moment Camilla's office moved too close to succession matters behind closed doors. Camilla heard Charles raise his voice in frustration and entered the room before anyone could invite her. Her sudden presence changing the temperature of the air, but doing absolutely nothing to change the legal reality of the ruling. The queen consort looked from her husband to her stepson, desperately searching for one human opening or emotional concession in a room that was now entirely ruled by hard legal limits. William turned toward her with controlled restraint, being careful not to sound unnecessarily cruel, but proving completely impossible to bend or manipulate. He stated clearly that the court's judgment left absolutely no room for private explanations, no quiet administrative adjustments, and no old family habits dressed up as royal loyalty. Camilla's face tightened in the dim light because she understood completely that this was no longer about being understood by her family. It was about being permanently stopped by the system. William then revealed the part that Charles had not been fully told by his advisors. The Clarence House memorandum was not the only document examined by the Constitutional Court. 3 later briefings had repeated the exact same pattern of informal influence, each one small enough to deny when taken alone, but incredibly dangerous when placed together as a pattern of behavior. Charles stared at his son in silence as the horrific realization finally arrived. The palace staff had deliberately shielded the king from the full scale of the mounting evidence, perhaps to protect his fragile peace, or perhaps to protect their own positions within the household. Either way, the final result was brutal. He had walked into this confrontation believing the legal case was narrow and easily managed, only to discover that a massive constitutional trap had been building around him for months. William placed the final court ruling firmly on the table and declared that every future succession paper would now move through an entirely different chain of authority that bypassed the king's private apartments. Charles did not answer, and Camilla did not move a muscle. The old, informal route of palace influence had been closed in front of them with one definitive sentence. And the conflict immediately left the family sitting room and entered the heavy machinery of institutional power that would decide who truly controlled the crown's future. Power did not shift with a loud shout or a dramatic confrontation. It shifted quietly through folders, official signatures, locked steel cabinets, and names being systematically removed from internal circulation lists. By that afternoon, the entire palace staff understood that Camilla's exclusion was not merely symbolic. It was strictly procedural, fully enforceable, and it was already happening while Charles still sat upstairs staring at the paperwork like a man watching the very walls of his reign move without his permission. Charles felt the institutional change before anyone could explain it to him fully. The confrontation with William had officially ended, but its administrative consequence had only just begun to ripple through the household. Downstairs, the Lord Chamberlain's office moved first and with absolute precision. The Lord Chamberlain is the senior royal official who helps manage the entire working structure of the royal household, and in this historic crisis, that office quickly became the place where raw emotion was transformed into cold, binding instruction. Constitutional advisors and senior private secretaries began completely restructuring how all succession-related documents would travel through the palace corridors. Every distribution list was checked line by line, every security permission was strictly reviewed, and every old habit suddenly looked incredibly dangerous to the lawyers involved. William's heir office was brought directly into the new chain of command, and that mattered immensely because the heir's office represents the future of the crown before it officially arrives. The monarch's constitutional office, the advisors tied directly to legal procedure, and designated custodians took absolute control of the secret papers that shaped future accession planning. Accession means the terrifyingly precise moment a new sovereign takes the throne, and anything connected to it now required the strictest protection available under the law. Camilla's entire household staff was left completely outside those channels, not paused, not politely delayed for a later date, but completely excluded. The word itself carried a distinct chill that no one in the palace dared to say too loudly in the corridors. A senior courtier sat before the digital distribution list and stopped with one finger hovering directly above the command key. Camilla's office had appeared on that specific access list for months, quietly included and never once questioned by those who preferred artificial palace peace more than constitutional clarity. The courtier removed her office name, paused for a brief second, and then firmly confirmed the system change. It was a remarkably small gesture, almost completely silent, but the systemic meaning was enormous. An entire corridor of private influence had narrowed into nothing with one single click, and the person making that change understood that history sometimes turns not through grand public speeches, but through quiet administrative obedience to the law. Charles later asked whether some small part of the process could remain unchanged for the sake of basic human dignity. He was not asking to overturn the court's ruling. He was merely begging for one thread of grace, one small sign that Camilla had not been publicly pushed beyond the inner circle of trust. The advisor's answer was careful but utterly devastating. Dignity now depended entirely on absolute compliance with the court. The king absorbed the sentence like a heavy private defeat. He had wanted mercy for his wife, but the institution gave him nothing but rigid procedure. Then came the dynamic shift regarding the locked registry. It held the highly confidential future accession protocols, meaning the private instructions and safeguards prepared for the next transfer of royal power. That registry moved under a new, secure custody, and Camilla's staff were formally informed they no longer held permission to request access under any circumstances. Catherine received a briefing copy in her office, her quiet inclusion signaling that the future household was already being prepared with much sharper boundaries. And the first real consequence arrived much sooner than anyone expected, when Camilla was blocked from attending a meeting she once entered without question. When the new administrative order reached her door, Camilla discovered that losing authority on paper was nothing compared to the brutal reality of feeling it vanish in public. The deep humiliation became agonizingly real in a narrow, brightly lit palace corridor. Camilla arrived for a scheduled succession briefing, dressed with the flawless composure of someone utterly determined not to show a single ounce of personal pain to the staff. But the junior aide standing guard at the door did not step aside as he usually did. Instead, he bowed deeply, spoke with a trembling voice, and told her that the meeting had been strictly reclassified. For several agonizing seconds, no one in the corridor moved. Then, with devastating clarity, Camilla understood that the palace had completely changed without her consent. Camilla held her silence much longer than anyone expected. The weekly meeting had once been completely routine, a palace gathering where future ceremony and royal duties were discussed in highly polished language. But now, under the High Court's brand new interpretation of succession authority, even basic routine had become dangerous. Succession authority meant the absolute legal power to shape, advise, or influence any matter directly connected to the line of the crown. That was precisely why this brief moment in the corridor mattered so much. It was never only about one missed briefing. It was about whether the queen consort could still stand anywhere near decisions that touched the future of the reign. The aide lowered his voice, as though a softer tone could somehow make the institutional refusal less brutal to her face. Camilla asked sharply whether Charles knew she had been stopped at the threshold, carrying a profound sense of utter disbelief. The guard stated that the new instruction had passed through formal constitutional channels, not personal royal preference. In other words, absolutely no one standing at the door was choosing to wound her pride. The system itself was simply obeying the law. A personal insult from a family member could be challenged, but a formal command from the institution could only be silently endured. Charles heard about the corridor incident just minutes later, and the news struck him in a vulnerable place that royal pride could not protect. He gripped the back of a gilded chair, completely torn between intense rage for his wife and the cold knowledge that any resistance on his part would deepen the public scandal. If he resisted the decree, the public story would no longer be about her exclusion. It would become about his own refusal to respect the court. Love demanded immediate movement, but duty demanded absolute stillness. Then the official palace memo arrived on his desk, and its cold language left absolutely no space for emotional comfort. Any further attempt to include Camilla in succession briefings could be treated as formal noncompliance. Noncompliance meant a direct failure to follow a legal order, and inside the modern monarchy, that was a major public danger to the survival of the crown. Her absence from the table was no longer just embarrassing. It was legally mandatory. Every single person who once willingly made space for her now had to actively prove they would not. William did not celebrate when he read the final memo in his office. The prince sat completely alone, closed his eyes briefly, and let the heavy weight of it pass through him. The legal decision protected George, Charlotte, and Louis, but it wounded Charles in a way that no loving son could ever ignore. Victory had come wrapped in deep family pain. That was precisely why the ultimate turning point arrived quietly, through a gentle request. Charles asked William for a private meeting without advisors, titles, or formal palace language. For the first time since the High Court ruling, father and son would meet not to argue over institutional authority, but to decide whether anything human could survive beneath it. The most important conversation happened completely without witnesses. Charles and William sat facing each other in a much smaller room than either man was used to using, and for once, neither reached for royal history as a protective shield. The king looked significantly older in the dim light, and the prince looked utterly exhausted. Between them lay the court ruling, no longer operating as a weapon, but as a clear mirror reflecting their fractured reality. Charles had requested the meeting because Camilla's exclusion from the briefing had made the consequences painfully real. It touched marriage, pride, authority, and the deep, buried fear that the monarchy had accepted her publicly while still refusing to trust her privately. It was never about reversing the ruling. Both men knew that was completely impossible. It was about whether the family could accept the hard boundary without tearing itself apart. William did not begin the conversation with an accusation. He waited patiently, and the silence gave the king the space to say what had been buried beneath every defense. Charles admitted he had desperately wanted Camilla to feel secure in a monarchy that had once rejected her completely. William listened intently, and when he finally answered, he did not dismiss his father's pain. He simply said that security could never come at the cost of constitutional clarity. The words were calm, but they cut straight to the heart of the crisis. William then spoke of George, Charlotte, and Louis, not as distant names in a line of succession, but as real children. He told Charles that their young lives could not become a bargaining ground for adult loyalties, old wounds, or palace guilt. George would one day carry a massive burden he had not chosen. Charlotte would live close enough to power to feel its dangerous pull, and Louis would grow inside a system where even small words could permanently shape expectations. None of them could be protected if confusion was allowed to dress itself as kindness. Charles finally gave the admission William needed to hear, stating that the Clarence House memorandum should never have been discussed outside the proper line. That one single sentence changed the emotional weight of everything between them. It did not erase the public humiliation, but it proved the king understood exactly where the boundary had been crossed. William did not ask Charles to choose between his wife and his crown. Instead, he asked him to protect Camilla by keeping her completely away from powers the court had now forbidden. The request carried mercy, but also absolute finality. A private truce steadied the palace for a fleeting moment. Yet outside the gates, the world had already turned the ruling into a massive national spectacle. While father and son found a fragile understanding behind closed doors, Britain woke to a headline that made the humiliation completely impossible to contain. By dawn, the palace could no longer control the story. Outside Buckingham Palace, cameras gathered before the gates. Inside, Charles watched the broadcasts in total silence, while Camilla learned that the world was no longer debating her influence. It was measuring her fall. Charles knew the official palace statement would never be enough. Careful words could not soften the blow of what the nation had already understood. Camilla had not simply been corrected. She had been publicly stripped of influence in the one area where influence mattered most. The ruling became the most dramatic restriction placed on a queen consort's palace role in modern royal memory. And that mattered because the monarchy depends entirely on confidence. Once the public sees a private boundary being enforced by law, the mystery of royal control begins to crack. Camilla kept her composure because pride was the very last thing left within her control. Public photographs released that day showed steadiness, but steadiness was not peace. A courtier noticed her hand resting tightly against the arm of a chair between takes, and that small detail carried more truth than the palace statement. This ruling did not question whether she belonged beside Charles. It declared exactly where she could not stand. Charles watched the morning coverage and lowered the television sound to spare Camilla from hearing her name repeated like a verdict. The king understood that every broadcast reduced a painful family fracture into a national spectacle. Yet he also knew the court had given the palace something it could not ignore, a hard boundary the monarchy needed in order to protect the succession. Then one front page captured the mood of the country perfectly, showing the Buckingham Palace gates under gray skies, with the headline stating succession power was removed from Camilla. By evening, a broadcaster outside the palace described the ruling as the day private influence met constitutional steel. It became the sentence people repeated because it gave shape to what they felt. The crown had finally pushed back against the private forces around it. William heard the phrase later and said nothing, and Catherine understood the silence completely. The prince had wanted protection, not a spectacle. The princess knew victory could still taste bitter when it came at the cost of family pain. As the public absorbed the shock, the palace prepared one final internal declaration that would define what the ruling truly meant. In the end, the ruling did not destroy the monarchy. It stripped away an illusion. It forced Charles to face the painful truth that affection cannot rewrite constitutional order. It forced Camilla to accept that personal loyalty does not create royal authority. And it forced William to become the guardian of a future he could no longer protect quietly. The crown had chosen the line. Charles knew the final palace declaration would hurt more than any headline. The declaration, meaning the official internal statement that tells the royal household how a decision must now be followed, confirmed full compliance with the court's ruling. Camilla would hold no authority, no advisory role, and no procedural access in any matter connected to succession. Succession, the order by which the crown passes from one royal figure to the next, was now visibly separated from marriage preference and private household influence. That separation mattered because the monarchy could not survive on affection alone. It needed certainty and boundaries. Charles signed the internal order slowly, his hand not shaking this time, but the stillness felt heavier than fear. The humiliation was not in the signature itself, but in what the signature admitted. The king had tried to elevate Camilla into safety, to wrap her place in dignity after years of rejection. Now he had to formalize the public limitation of the woman he had fought to protect. Camilla stood close enough to understand every word, yet far enough to feel what had been lost. She accepted the decision in silence, not defeated as a wife, but undeniably diminished as a palace force. Camilla did not ask for comfort, because comfort could not restore authority. The queen consort remained beside Charles, but her power had been confined to roles the crown could safely defend. That was the brutal compromise. She kept the title, but she lost the reach. Charles remained king, and she remained queen, but the future no longer bent around their private wishes, and that truth changed the emotional shape of the reign. William stood beside Catherine after the declaration was completed, and neither spoke at first. The princess understood the relief in him before he named it. George, Charlotte, and Louise now sat behind a clearer constitutional wall, protected from the soft pull of adult loyalties and palace guilt. The prince had won the argument he never wanted to fight, but victory carried sorrow because it wounded his father and reduced Camilla in the eyes of the nation. This moment meant humiliation for Charles, heartbreak for Camilla, and painful vindication for William. For the monarchy, it became a necessary correction, proving that the crown survives only when personal devotion bows before the succession it is sworn to protect. The door closed on the crisis not with triumph, but with a hard-won silence, the kind that follows a royal family after the crown has spoken, and no one inside it can pretend they did not hear. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next video.